Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, William Markham, author of The Foreman's Boys.
William Markham, author of The Foreman's Boys, the story of Civilian Conservation Corps Company 1333, Camp S-63, Poe Valley. Why'd you write your book?
Well, I heard endless stories about the CCCs from my grandfather, who was foreman in this particular camp that I've written about. And as a young boy, those stories were intriguing to me, and it sounded like something that was going to be great fun, even though I would eventually learn that I couldn't be in a CCC camp. After his passing, unbeknownst to the rest of us in the family, we found a trunk full of CCC history that my grandfather had kept from his time in the camp, and it was photographs and textual documents and receipts and drawings and logs and engineers' comments, things that we knew nothing about, camp newsletters that were prepared by the boys in the camp. This would spur me on to want to know more about the CCCs, and eventually, through assistance of a couple of local veterans who were in the area, my mother and my wife and I, we hosted a reunion of the veterans. This was, I believe, plus or minus 83 or 84. And we held these for approximately 15 years. And unfortunately, these veterans were of an age where they weren't going to be with us very long or much longer. And so there was a lull where we didn't have reunions, but I continued my gathering of CCC history of Poe Valley, which was challenging because the history of the CCC is not something you go down to your local library and get very much information about. You can get some generalized history of the CCC's involvement in the country, but not camp specific. So I continued a little more searching to find that the National Archives wasn't going to give me very much either, as well as state archives, but there was some information. Then in, I believe it was 2012, I was asked if I might have an interest in doing a collaborative effort with our local historical society, and I kind of jumped on it right away. And that also spurred me to want to try to find out a few more things, and eBay has become a very good friend of mine. I was able to find more photographs. I was able to find a few more documents, and I was also able to find other sources that had information that I knew nothing about. Specifically, the newsletters that were prepared by the CCC boys in these various camps are all kept in the library at the University of Chicago in Champaign. And sure enough, even though I had many, they had every newsletter that was prepared by the camp, as well as I would learn almost every other camp throughout the country. That collection is huge, and it gave me a very large source to find out things that went on in the camp. These newsletters were prepared by the boys in the camp, and we'll get back to why I refer to boys here in a bit. But I've I had a large collection of things and information that others shared along the course of these reunions, and then these collaborative efforts started, and we were getting visitation by extended family, the grandsons and great grandsons and great nieces, and these folks came with more information. They had heard snippets of this and snippets of that. Grandpa told them this, Grandpa told them that. So taking all of that together, my wife kept reminding me that I ought to write a book. I had this wealth of information. Now, mind you, I've never written anything. And so finally, after hearing that I ought to write a book about a dozen times, I said, okay, I'll sit down and write a book. Forgetting that I did not know how to type, that is. And 3 years later, I was fortunate enough to have the book published, and here we are today.
So for people who were watching this who know nothing about the CCC, what was it?
The CCC was a program that was developed out of the New Deal package in the FDR administration. And it was one of the more favored programs that came out of the New Deal. There were so many programs that came from the New Deal era. And we all know it today as CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. Its origin name, however, was ECW, or Emergency Conservation Work.
Emergency referring to the Depression?
Correct. And this was a program to put young men 17 to 25 years of age to work, to give them a job. They were the most, or a part of the most hard struck people of the Depression time who couldn't get a job. Jobs were scarce. And if there was a job in the family to be had, Dad had the job, and unfortunately, the sons were just out on the streets. And this was a target-specific program to put that age group to work and give them employment.
How big was it?
The overall scope of the CCC program was quite significant. There were more than 4,000 camps throughout the continental United States. Here in Pennsylvania, we had more than 150 camp locations.
How did they recruit people? How did they find the people to man the camps?
This was a unique time in American history when all facets of government, local government, state government, federal government, came together and literally overnight joined forces and made things happen. The state government had the responsibility of developing needs, what was going to be done by these CCC boys. However, the local government was charged with enlisting young men into the program, and they were referred to as enrollees. And they would go to their county seat offices and sign up into the program for initially it was for a 6-month period of time.
How did the CCC choose who went and who didn't go?
Pretty much, if it was a you showed up and you were healthy, you were pretty much going to be in a sense. Early on, when the program was offered, young men charged to the enlistment centers because desperation was there. They didn't have jobs. They had no income. And many of them were on the streets. Sadly, it was a time when those young men were basically not living at home because there wasn't any opportunity at home. They were literally on the street. But the centers then would send them, in the very beginning, would send them on to an induction center, much like the military, to where they would get physicals and they would get fed well 3 times a day. And after they would have a large enough group, which was roughly 160 men, they would then take the whole group off to a camp location and set up camp. This would change after time, where they wouldn't go from the county office to an induction center and then on to a camp. Later on, once the induction centers and the camps had been developed, they basically didn't need the induction centers. So these young men would just go straight from an enlistment center in their county off to a campsite.
And you said it was a 6-month term they would sign up for?
Correct.
Could they re-up?
In the beginning, they could not. It was, you have 6 months opportunity here, and there's so many others that we want to provide opportunities for that they were not allowed to. As the program aged and the economy started to get a little better, there were more jobs back home. So there wasn't such a clamoring to enlist. So to fulfill enlistment needs and fulfill projects that had been developed to be performed by these CCC boys, enlistment terms were extended.
Were they paid?
They were paid a whole $1 a day for their work. And of that $1 a day, at the end of the month, when payday came, they only got $5. $25 had to go home in the form of an allotment. And this was something that they had to agree upon whenever they signed into the program.
Tell me about your grandfather.
Well, my grandfather was, I think best way to describe my grandfather was he was what we would call a jack of all trades and master of none. When he was 33 years old, he was given an opportunity to be a foreman in a CCC camp. His resume at the time had a list of things, his background, and he was a lumberman, he was a sawyer, he was a thrashing machine operator, he had been a heavy equipment operator, and a carpenter. And those were some of the key types of things that the men who were being hired on to be foremen in these CCC camps, they were going to work forestry services. So he had a bit of a background that fit the bill, so to speak.
So he was not a recruit like the others. Did he sign up for a 6-month term, or was his job open-ended?
His job was open-ended. Basically, the camp setup was you had the CCC boys, and the camp was administered by the federal government, and the camps used the U.S. Army as its management team. So in the camps, you would have typically assigned military officers, 2 or 3 or 4 of them, who were orchestrating the health and welfare of a CCC camp. Then the next group of people, administration, were basically men who were hired through the Bureau of Forestry to be a foreman, to ramrod these young men around and throughout the forest to do the jobs of forest management and forest cultivation and do other works, building roads, building bridges, the things that the boys were going to perform their works in. So these foremen were signed on, and it was a full-time job for them. And they lived the life of the CCC boys as well. They lived in the camp. They had quarters in the camp. They were fed in the camp. So they were along the way with the boys doing the same thing, living the same lifestyle.
And you mentioned the boys, it's all male?
It's all male.
Was it integrated?
It was never integrated, not the original CCC program.
Now, did the workers have to have any special skills? The boys have to have any special skills going in?
Not at all. These young men, their principal necessity or fulfillment was labor. They were in a work camp. So the only skill they had to have was a willingness to work 8 hours a day.
Could they quit?
They could walk away anytime.
Could they be fired?
Yes is the answer to that question, but they basically were so desperate to have a job that they would toe the line, so to speak. They didn't tend to step out and become too problematic for management.
Now, your book is about a particular CCC camp in the Poe Valley. Where is the Poe Valley?
Poe Valley is located geographically right in the center of the state of Pennsylvania.
Why was that area picked for a CCC camp?
It's very mountainous, and the initial works of the CCCs, and throughout its whole lifetime, was forest restoration and forest management. The country had gone through a time where if it was a tree, they sawed it down and turned it into lumber for building all around. And conservation was a word that people knew but was not very well organized. And we had severely depleted our forests, and they needed cultivated and cleaned up and put back together again, so to speak, which was the principal purpose of the program.
So put yourself in the shoes of a 17, 18-year-old recruit. You show up and they say, okay, you're going to that camp. What's the experience like?
Well, I would learn that the experience was terrifying, frightening, exhilarating, and aw shucks, what did I get myself into? I would hear so many comments from veterans that we had sat with during these reunions. They were excited to have had an opportunity for a job and have some money in their pockets, as well as help family back home. And that was a big reason for joining and signing up into a CCC camp. Not so much to have a dollar in their own pockets, but to be able to help mom and dad back home provide for the family. But they would sign on. They would not know where they were going. There wasn't any guarantee of a contract. The only issue that was provided, or I should say not issued, in the beginning, these young men stayed within the confines of the state of Pennsylvania. They did not go or would not be shipped off to another state, north, south, east, or west.
But you wouldn't necessarily be assigned to the one closest to your home.
In the beginning, you weren't. There was the concern that, if you're first time away from home and you're homesick, you could just walk home. So that was the principal reason for shuffling them around the states, thinking that the military term of AWOL would not become problematic for them.
So describe the camp, the Poe Valley camp.
The Poe Valley camp, like so many other camps, it was pretty well detailed in a military fashion. You would have barracks buildings that would hold 40 men, a mess hall. There would be a recreation hall. There was a headquarters building. Every military operation needs a headquarters building. There was a shower house. There were officers' quarters where the military officers stayed. There was a forestry quarters building. There were garages and maintenance shops erected, depending upon what the camp's performance was expected to be. There was also an infirmary on most of the camps.
Was there a doctor on hand?
There was. One of the three officers, typically in a CCC camp, was a military surgeon. So by and large, if you would look at this from a bird's eye view, you would see what you would think is this small military encampment, when in fact, that's basically what you were looking at, except these CCC boys, although they were in uniform, wearing World War I surplus clothing, in lieu of seeing them, in a regimental fashion carrying rifles, they They were just out and about carrying picks and shovels.
And there was a camp store?
There was. In the recreation hall, there was a small PX where the boys could buy candies, they could buy tobacco products. Depending upon where the camp was located and what proximity of things were available, there were camps that might even have ice cream. Very, very few, but they would have it. But Poe Valley was not one of those camps.
Did it operate year-round?
All year round, 365 days a year. It was in occupation.
So they were able to do their work in the winter?
All winter long, every day, weather was just something you dealt with. You put on a heavier coat.
You say in your book that the only heat was from a fireplace?
In the barracks buildings, the heat for the boys was in two heat stoves that were fired by coal. In the other buildings, the officers' quarters, forestry quarters, those were fireplaces was the only other, that was their heat source. All the other buildings had these smaller sized coal-fired heating stoves.
How many people in the whole camp?
Well, typically there was going to be 160 enrollees, and then the accompaniment of officers and foremen would bring a camp total to approximately 182 people.
What was a typical day like? They wake up in the morning, and what time did they wake up, and just take us through a day?
A day in the life of a CCC boy was like most any other worker. These were work camps. Their job was they worked a 7:30 to 4:30 or 7 to 3:30, depending upon administration's what they wanted to set for work hours. But they were awakened usually at 6 o'clock. They were given breakfast, and then they mobilized for the day, whatever gear they needed, what the weather conditions were. They dressed for it. Again, they had military surplus clothing. Now, like all other military operations, if you were a 34 waist, 30 length trouser, you might have a 36 inch waist pair of dungarees given to you, but it may not fit you as well as you would like it to, but they were surplus. So they were engaged for a job for the day. At the end of the day, they were brought back to the camp where they cleaned up for the evening meal. They had mess at 5 o'clock typically, or 5:30 depending upon who was running things at the time. And then the rest of their day was free time. They would, depending upon time of year, there were sports activities. There was a recreation hall to go into where they could read, write letters back home, card games. They had billiard table, dartboards. Typical recreational activities were provided.
Could they go into town? Was there a town to go into?
Well, depending upon where the camp's proximity was to a town, they could. In the case of Poe Valley's camp, the two neighboring towns were, one was called Millheim and the other one was called Lewistown. And they could go anytime they wanted to, but you had to walk. And Millheim was the most close town. It was an 8-mile journey one way. Lewistown was about 14 miles one way. But however, the weekends were a different time. The weekends were free time again.
They had both days off?
They had both days off. They worked Monday to Friday, like an average worker. And so the weekends, yes, they had a lot more liberal free time. However, the camp military officers, as part of recreation, would provide transportation to town. And that was usually very well received by the boys. They wanted to get out of camp and get to town and, just might be able to casually meet some lovely young girl and have a date for the weekend.
You said there were dances sometimes?
In the camp,
Yeah.
Part of the recreation program was to host a dance. And these were also very, very well received by the boys because chaperoned young girls were brought into the camp as typically as well as an orchestra. And that was the case at Poe Valley. There were several orchestras that performed in the camp, and these were fun times for them. They would serve refreshments, and the dances in the beginning weren't so many, but I would learn and read through documents that it kind of got to be, well, boys, it's the 1st of July. Don't you think we ought to have a dance? They would come up with all kinds of good reasons to host a dance event.
You think that fathers in town might be reluctant to have their daughters go into this camp full of adolescent males?
I think reluctant is a kind word. Certainly, the CCC boys were viewed by fathers as trouble. They're young men. They're unmarried, which was another requirement of being a CCC boy. You could not be married. So, certainly they wanted the company of young ladies, and most fathers, was like, when the CCC boys come to town, you're not going out this evening. That was a common theme that I would learn. But also, we would learn that in the case of Poe Valley, when the boys came to town, actually, people kind of looked forward to it. They were not trouble. We never found any issue of police action against these CCC boys. One of the things I learned was that they had taken on these jobs. They knew not where they were. They didn't know what they were going to be doing. But the foreman tended to be a father-like figure. And for the most part, there was a very good relationship between the foreman and the boys. They worked together all day long. They knew each other. They would learn their habits. They would learn, things that were encouraged and things that were not encouraged. And for one of the times, I would find out that a lot of these boys, they didn't want to embarrass these foremen, because these foremen were from the local towns mostly, particularly the Millheim area. So they didn't cause trouble, is what I'm really trying to say. And yes, certainly I know that a lot of fathers were looking out for their daughters, but we would also learn certainly that a lot of young men who had come from various parts of the states, various parts of the state, would in fact become enamored with a young lady of the local area, and marriages occurred.
Were there city boys in this too?
These were boys from all parts on all walks of life. Boys from the hard-hit area, the cities, the Philadelphia, Pittsburgh regions. Boys from areas where jobs were so difficult to acquire. The coal mining regions, the steel making areas, all of those areas. These boys came from, and they were just mixed together. There was no assignment based upon where you were from or any other condition. You just went where you were assigned.
So you would have had all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds too. I mean, Irish and Polish and Lithuanian and Italian.
Absolutely. When you look at the roster of names that we have in the book, you just see names from every ethnicity and every region that had come to America.
And they got along?
Well, I never found written accounts where, the Irish squared off with the Polish, but, certainly there had to have been times when people weren't going to get along. You put 160 young men together in a confined area, they're not all going to be happy with each other. However, the military was good at providing recreational activities that would bring them together in a team atmosphere, as well as they weren't separated, so they had a bunk beside each other. They had to sit down at the mess hall with each other. They learned to get along. Military also had a good way of settling conflict. This camp, as well as many other camps, had a small boxing ring. And typically, when Bob couldn't get along with John, okay, boys, put on the cuffs and let's settle this. And in many cases, it was settled.
What kind of stories did your grandfather tell?
Well, my grandfather was a practical jokester. He enjoyed a good joke on people, and they would. The foreman in most of these stories weren't practical jokes assigned to the CCC boys. They were assigned to other management personnel who had come to Poe Valley from either they were known as Harrisburg men or Washington men from my grandfather, and he would tell of these practical jokes that they would pull on these guys. They would take out road signs so that whenever they were leaving, they would get lost. There was another great story that he loved to tell. In the foreman's quarters, the food was brought to them from the mess hall by a steward, so they ate family style. And when they had a visitor from camp, mostly these were inspectors coming to inspect this, inspect that. And if you can maybe well imagine, you put a bureaucracy together, there's going to be inspections following it. And some of these inspectors, maybe not as kind as others, maybe would say things that were taken in the wrong context. And if that happened, even though they would be invited to the evening meal, they would usually be the butt of something. And one of these issues was a drip glass. And my brother still has this particular glass, but it was just a conventional water glass, like everybody else was sitting at the table. And it was flowered, had a flowered pattern on it, and it had this very teeny tiny little hole drilled in it. And the unsuspecting inspector would take a drink, and of course it would dribble out just a little bit and down across the front of his shirt. And of course the foreman was sitting there like nothing happened. And of course they're just, wanting to bust up in laughter. So those were the types of practical things that he would talk about, or practical jokes, I should say. His other commentary was the boys. He always referred to these young men as the boys. The boys did this, the boys did that. He would tell of their labors, their works. They built roads, they built trails, they cut in numerous fire stops. They did a lot of hard work, swinging of axe, pick and shovel work, building a road by pick and shovel and taking large rocks and smashing them into small rocks with 10 and 12 and 16-pound sledgehammers all day long. This was not something that was for not a lot of labor intensity. So they learned how to work with each other. He would tell of teaching them how to not have such a sore back at the end of the day. He enjoyed the work that they did. They built a dam. It's a 660-foot long earthen masonry combination dam, still there today. It created a 27-acre lake that is still a recreational lake that Pennsylvanians come to every year and have been since the day it was opened.
That's a state park now?
That's a state park, Poe Valley State Park. And part of that dam was a masonry spillway, so there was a lot of concrete involved. All that concrete was mixed by hand. My grandfather talked of teaching these young boys skills. masonry skills, carpentry skills, how to build forms for concrete, how to build a road, how to put up a head wall so that you could divert drainage and send it underneath. He became attached to these boys. They were his boys, so to speak. And there was never in a demeaning or a derogatory manner. His perception of these young men, they were boys to him.
So was the idea that they would learn usable skills, that they would be able to go out and get jobs when they were done?
In the very beginning, the idea was just find something for these young men to do so that they can have some money in their pocket and some money can go back home. And the initial direction was to go into these forested areas and do what needed to be done to bring life back into forests, tree management. And I can't sit here and be very expansive on forestry management. I truly don't know what it really means. I know that they planted tens of thousands of trees. They did timber surveys. They would go acre by acre and count every tree and identify what was there. So there was a lot of work being done in forestry management that I truly don't know what it all was, but they did so many other things as well. And they built their own barracks buildings, so they would pick up carpenter skills if they were there in the very beginning. Eventually, these other jobs would come along. The dam didn't happen in day one. The dam wasn't started until the third year of the camp's life. So the answer to that question is, by the second year of the program, the administration had learned that this was going to be a great opportunity for young minds to continue their education. And they actually set up a continuing program and provided an education advisor in the camps.
You have a schedule in there, a couple different schedules of the classes, and it's in blacksmithing, blueprint reading, auto mechanics, woodwork, first aid, foreman training.
Absolutely. Those were the opportunities made available at this particular camp. And those teachings were provided by these foremen, military officers, the education advisor. They were the ones who held class, so to speak. And yes, for many of these young men from the cities and areas that you weren't a farm boy, where you pretty well knew you had to know how to do many things, they would pick up a skill, and for many of them, that skill was taken through the rest of their life. Truck driving, mechanics, carpentry. Mind you, now they're only there for 6 months in the beginning, so it wasn't like they could get a real intense educational program and go through it. But as the program expanded and developed, the educational part of it did key day one. By the end of the CCC era, when you enlisted into the program, you actually had to agree that you would take part in some form of continuing education.
Now, I guess since the dam that you said that they built is still there, they must have brought in someone who knew how to build a dam?
The camp had an assigned engineer, and he did have some skills on building a dam. The dam construction story at Poe Valley is kind of entertaining. There's several parts to it. One part, my grandfather and the rest of his group of foremen, along with the camp superintendent, who was in charge of all of the foremen and in charge of administering the work, the 8 to 5 work that was going to be done. All of those men, excepting for the camp engineer, had nothing more than a grammar school education, an 8th grade education. However, all of those foremen, the camp superintendent, and one camp engineer built that dam. My grandfather knew no more about building a dam than I know about performing open heart surgery, day one. But he was mechanically minded. He had a background in handling equipment, a background in carpentry, and a background in general skills. My grandfather was a farm boy, so he knew a lot of differing things. And the engineer, he had quite a task in surveying was his principal job, keeping things straight and level. But the rest of the work was managed by these foremen, and the handling and the physical labor was all done by these boys who knew not how to build a dam or had no prior experience of building a dam, but there it is today.
Was your grandfather from the area?
He was. He grew up about 5 miles as the crow flies from the camp itself.
So he got to go home occasionally?
The foreman had quarters in the camp provided for them, and he could go home anytime he wanted.
Was he married at the time?
He was married. He lived in the nearby town of Millheim. However, at the time, the roads in and out of Poe Valley were nothing more than rutted dirt trails. They hadn't yet been expanded into the roads that the CCC boys would eventually create. He did have a car, but buying gas it took money, and he was paid fairly well for his job. In fact, the townspeople were envious of my grandfather. He had a job that got him $135 a month, which was a rather princely sum, particularly for its time. But they worked long hours. They didn't work 8 to 5. They had to be there around 6 o'clock in the morning to get things organized and get ready for the day. And then they worked in the evening hours, fixing equipment that had broken down and preparing for the next day's activities. So for the most part, the foreman did not go home until the weekend came.
Could the recruits go home? Did they ever get home leave during their 6 months?
There wasn't a leave where they were given so many days that you can just go off and do whatever you want. However, the holidays were a time when, if they could get transportation, which was costly, basically the only mode of transportation at the time was trains. So if they could afford a ticket, they could go home on a weekend if they wanted to, or they could go home during the holiday periods if the camp commander was going to allow days off. Those things changed depending upon work schedules. There were times I would learn that a couple of days after Christmas, or even maybe the whole period of time between Christmas and New Year's, if they didn't have a work schedule that something had to be completed, the camp was pretty much open, and the boys could leave and go home. But if there was a work assignment, like whenever the dam was being built, every day that there was on this calendar, there basically was going to be scheduled work down at the dam. So yes, they could go home if they could find a way in or afford a way.
You also said that they built bridges?
They built many bridges in Poe Valley. Some of them still stand today. They're not mighty bridges like cross the Susquehanna. They cross small streams, maybe 20, 30 feet long, but having stone abutments and concrete decks as a crossway. Yes, they built them under the administration of those same foremen that were managing building the dam.
How much of what they built is still standing?
Well, the dam still stands. My last count of the 14 bridges that I knew they built, there's still 8 of them in service.
Did you visit other CCC camps?
I have. My grandfather also worked at another CCC camp, a location called Parker Dam out in Clearfield County. But during the course of wanting to know more about CCC activities, I've visited numerous state parks around the state.
Is there much evidence today that the CCC was there?
There's not much standing. There are a few sites that have a few buildings, original barracks buildings, mess halls, but by and large, they're all gone.
You mentioned the camp newsletter. Did you found a lot of those?
I was fortunate enough to find all of them. My grandfather had, from the time that the camp newsletter started, he had about half of the ones that were published through the time he was there before he left. But then through another association with a professor that I would come across, I was able to actually garner a copy of each one of them that's maintained in the archives at the University of Chicago in Champaign.
And you're right about the name of the newsletter was The Raven, R-A-V-I-N, which is kind of a clever play on words.
And it was. Poe Valley has, legend holds that the Poe family of its most infamous, I shouldn't say infamous, famous known person is Edgar Allan Poe, the famed poet. However, that's only legend. It was a Poe family that settled the Poe Valley area. However, its direct tie to Edgar Allan is still being sought out. And continuing legend has it that Edgar Allan himself actually visited the area while he was doing some background genealogy of his own family and found it to be the place to write The Raven, one of his most well-known poems. All legend. However, I do know there's certainly a lot of folks out there today trying to connect the dots and dispel and make it a truism. That hasn't yet happened. But the name of the newsletter was given as a piece to Edgar Allan's most famous poem, The Raven, but spelled differently.
Yes, like raving. What do you get out of reading those newsletters?
The newsletters were prepared by the boys in the camp. They had an editor, and they were managed by the education advisor. So the editor was a CCC boy, and then all the contributors were the CCC boys. So it was whatever they could get them to say, they would write down. Now, one has to remember, this is in the 30s when you kind of could write anything you want, say anything you want, and people would just type it out. But mostly it was filled with accounts of sporting events, the box scores for baseball games, inter barrack activities, and of course there were the barracks lines, and this was they were mostly comical lines about Joe in barracks 1 did something to Bob in barracks 2. I can't sit here and expand on the exact text, but it just told of who was there and what was going on at the time.
You reproduce a crossword puzzle from one of the issues.
I do. The camp commander, along with the education advisor, had a contest, and the contest was to be able to answer the crossword puzzle. And for a princely sum, $1, a whole $1, that's a lot of money, it's a whole day's wage, was awarded to whoever could come up with the answers to the crossword puzzles first.
Well, you also talked, speaking of $1, of the coupon books that they'd use in the camp store.
Mm-hmm. They had these coupon books that they could buy for $1 a piece, and then there was 5-cent stamps inside of it, and they could take that to the PX and buy candies, trade them in for candies or tobacco products or whatever else may be available at the camp store. But it was a way to, the military has long ago learned that when you give a young man cash money, He's usually not very well managed in how to keep sums of money in his pocket. So that was one of the ways of being able to have these young enrollees who now had a few dollars in their pocket at payday. They would encourage them to go buy these booklets because they wouldn't tend to get rid of the stamps as quickly as they might go to town and spend all of that money in a weekend's period of time.
You mentioned that the camp store sold tobacco, and you say that smoking, you write this, smoking was described as a way of exhibiting being older than you actually were and being a tough guy, meaning you do not want to mess with me as I smoke, and as such I will kick your butt.
Well, that was a story related to me a couple of times over by veterans, and it was a perception of the time. If you were a smoker, you had the, you did the deep inhale and, let it out through your nose, and something of which I could never handle myself. But it was perceived as, okay, I'm a little older, I'm a little more mature, I'm more of a man than you might be.
Where's your grandfather's memorabilia collection now?
I have all of it, and I've added to it over the years, many parts and pieces. eBay has become a very good friend of mine.
So you're the pack rat that you said your grandfather was.
I have become that pack rat, and we have a large collection of photographs, camp photographs. There were annual photographs that were prepared by the military. The yearbook style, where you had the long framed picture with everybody in it. However, they weren't done every year. They were only done, in fact, they were only ever done 2 times. But I stand corrected. The camp photo was done almost annually. Not every year, but almost. There was a yearbook that was created, but the yearbooks were only created 2 times.
Oh, just a separate note, we talked about the 6-month term and they could re-up for it, but what's the longest someone could spend there?
Well, I think if you could enamor yourself to the camp commander, and he was willing to sign it off, you could probably stay a couple of 3 or 4 years near the end of the program. I have accounts where I do know, I have records that I do know that there were guys who had been there for more than 2 years. So I don't know really how that all transitioned. But there had to be some favoritism provided in some manner.
Did you come across any evidence of somebody wanting to re-up and the camp commander says, "Oh, no thanks"?
No, I don't think I ever heard that.
I want to read this. This is out of the September 1939 edition of the Poe Valley Raven, and the headline is "What's Wrong with the CCC?" It starts by saying the main fault with the CCC at the present time is the influx of an overwhelming number of kids as substitutes for the many thousands of camp-wise men who were forced to leave due to the 2-year limit. These kids today, and this was written by the boys in the camp.
It is. One of the things to look at is the date that was written. It was after the program had been in place for 5 years, almost 6. And what was happening at the time was the camps had reached this point where there was a 2-year limit on how long you could stay. Then you had to go. You were done. So these guys who had been around for quite a while had, they knew the lay of the land. They knew what was expected of them. And they weren't problematic at all. And the jobs that needed to be, the work that needed to be performed, again, it was labor intensive. They would get the job done, so to speak. However, these new recruits coming in, they didn't know. This is brand new to them. They don't know what to expect. They don't know what's expected of them. They've got to figure out how to integrate themselves into this group of seasoned veterans and get along. So I believe that this writing was more personal than it was camp-wide, but I don't know for certain. But I thought it was entertaining, and that's why I included it in the book.
You also write about numerous celebrities were in the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is nationally, I suppose. And included were test pilot Chuck Yeager, boxer Archie Moore, actors Raymond Burr, Walter Matthau, and Robert Mitchum. Mm-hmm. And the Poe Valley camp had its own semi-celebrity, the cartoonist Martin Filchock.
Yes. So maybe I'll pose it back to you. Might you know who Martin Filchock is?
Well, I didn't before I read your book.
I think anybody who is of our age group that's sitting here today, we know of Martin Filchock. We just may not know who Martin Filchock is. Martin Filchock was a cartoonist, but he was also a CCC boy in Poe Valley. But he would eventually go on to become a very well-respected cartoonist. His shoulder buddies were Hank Ketchum, Charles Schultz, the creator of Dennis the Menace and the Snoopy characters, the more widely well-known cartoon characters. But Martin Filchock's contribution was the Check and Double Check cartoon that we all saw as young kids, particularly in the magazine Highlights for Children, but in also many other publications. And this was, if you'll recall, you had two cartoon pictures sitting side by side, and they looked identical at first glance, but there were small little nuances in them that were different. And the challenge was to find the 5 different things, or 4 different things, or 10 different things in each one of those cartoons. One might be the seal sitting on a beach and has a ball on its nose, and the picture beside it, the seal doesn't have the ball, and of course you would pick out. So the Check and Double Check cartoon was created by Martin Filchock.
We only have about a minute left, but can you, in a minute, talk about how it all wound down? When did they decide to end it?
The program ended in 1941 as we were looking ahead at World War II. The necessity for the program started to wane. The economy had picked up, jobs were more available back home, enlistment was challenging, they weren't able to get recruits to fulfill camp rosters, and the war, once the war started, it truly took those young boys from the forest to the battlefield, and that's another whole piece of CCC history that we don't have time to talk about, the involvement of CCC boys in World War II.
We are out of time. We've been speaking to William Markham. He is the author of this book, The Foreman's Boys, the story of Civilian Conservation Corps Company 1333, Camp S-63, Poe Valley, Pennsylvania. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.